Today, we are kicking off a brand new series entitled 90. It's actually a series that we're borrowing from Andy Stanley, but I'm really excited about this series. And here's what we're going to do in the series. For the next 90 days, about 10 weeks, and that's kind of where the sermon series gets its title, but for about the next 90 days, what we're going to do is we're going to travel through the life of Jesus, and we're going to take a look at some of his most significant events, some of his most significant conversations, and some of his most significant encounters. And we're going to start from the moment when he's introduced as an adult, sort of a teacher, and then we're going to travel through, and I wish we could cover everything, but we're not going to be able to. But we're going to travel through to the moment when he ends up dying on a cross for the sins of the world. And the thing that excites me about this series is that all throughout the series, we are going to talk about a singular principle, a principle that's incredibly powerful, but somehow, some way, a whole bunch of Christians who grew up in church missed this. I don't know if it's because pastors didn't talk about it. I don't know if it's because they talked about it and we were sleeping or our mind was wandering or whatever, but it's a principle that's true. And it's powerful, and we've missed it, and many of us have, and the reason, because we've missed it, it explains why for some of us, religion is confusing. This one principle and the fact that we missed it explains why for some of us, the Bible doesn't make sense, and we're confused about Christianity. And for some of us, this principle explains why church is boring for some of you. It also explains why, because we missed this, it explains why some of you, maybe even at some point in your life, you walked away from church and God prematurely. And we're gonna kind of unpack that. But the principle that we've missed somehow is simply this. Jesus came to introduce something brand new to the world. When you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the biographies of Jesus' life, it's abundantly clear that Jesus came to introduce something new. He didn't come to introduce Judaism 2.0. He didn't come to retool and rebrand Judaism. He didn't come so that you and I could have two parts to our Bible, an Old Testament and a New Testament. Jesus came to introduce something new to the world. More specifically, Jesus came to introduce something brand new for the world. Now, almost every single headliner that I have ever met or that I've ever gone to see has some warm-up acts. Sometimes they have a couple of them, and people who come out and their job is to sort of warm up the crowd and get everybody ready for the headliner, the guy or the gal that everybody's actually, or the band, that everybody's actually shown up to see. Well, Jesus in the first century actually had a warm-up act too, and his warm-up act was a guy, you're probably familiar with him, named John the Baptist. Now, it's important that you understand that he was called John the Baptist. He got that nickname not because he liked Baptist better than Methodists or Presbyterians or Episcopalians or Catholics. He was called John the Baptist because, and this is pretty significant, he was the first guy that we are aware of in history that ever baptized somebody by physically grabbing them and kind of manhandling them. He's the first guy. In fact, in the first century, baptism was a multifaceted process, and there were a whole bunch of parts to it. It started out, there was a ceremonial meal, and then there were things you had to learn, and then other hoops you had to jump through. And baptism for them was something that was only for Gentile people. And people who were Gentiles, not Jewish, but Gentiles, they participated in baptism. And it was an act by which they essentially said, I'm dying to my Gentileness, and I'm coming alive to my Jewishness. And normally, all this process ended with a ceremonial washing that they called a baptism. And almost always you did it in a private space by yourself, and never, ever, ever, ever did anybody ever touch you when you were being baptized. And so John got his nickname, John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, because he was the first guy to start grabbing people and throwing them down into the water when he baptized them. Now, the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are the biographies of Jesus' life, and each of these writers sort of talk about John the Baptist. Luke, he kind of introduces Jesus' warm-up act, John the Baptist, this way in Luke chapter 3. He says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. So let me sort of call a timeout here, because normally when you and I, what Luke's doing here is pretty significant, but normally what you and I do when we encounter passages like this in the Bible, when there are names that we don't understand and places we don't know how to pronounce, here's what we normally do. And this is honest space, so here's what we do. We normally speed read through that sucker, don't we? We read as fast as we can until we finally get to parts that we start to understand again. That's what we do. And so, but here's what you need to know. There's something important about what Luke is doing here. You see, by doing what Luke is doing here, what he's doing is he's telling would-be skeptics, hey, if you don't believe what I'm about to tell you, fact check me. That's what Luke is doing here. Luke writes his account of the life of Jesus from the perspective of a careful historian. He has researched this stuff, he has talked to eyewitnesses, and so he wants his audience to know that what he's about to say can be trusted. He wants them to know, look, this isn't a fairy tale. This isn't one of those stories that begins with once upon a time, and everybody kind of knows everything from there on out is just made up. This isn't long ago in a galaxy far away. John wants his audience to know that he wants his audience to know that the things that he is saying are grounded in history. So what he does is he starts at the macro level and he works his way down to the micro level. He goes, okay guys, before we get started, all this stuff happened when this guy was the emperor, and then this guy was the governor, and then these guys were the sub-governors, and then these folks were the high priests, and his audience is sort of tracking with him, going, okay. And all of a sudden they know that what they're about to read, that they can trust. So then Luke begins to introduce John, and here's what he says. The word of God came to John, talking about John the Baptist, son of Zechariah in the wilderness. Now from here, Matthew sort of unpacks more of the story for us, and here's what he says. People went out to him, talking about John the Baptist, from Jerusalem and all Judea and the whole region of the Jordan. Now this is important information. Essentially what Luke and Matthew are sort of teaming up to tell us is that this stuff happened. It really was, you can be found in history, it's accurate. And what was happening is that John wasn't this sort of crazy preacher that had these crazy ideas and a handful of followers that everybody else wondered, what's wrong with those folks? I mean, literally, all of Jerusalem and all of Judea and the whole region of the Jordan. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were making their way to the Jordan River basin where John was preaching, to hear him preach and be a part of what he was doing. Now, what you need to understand about this is that this is not a convenient, easy trip. Early last year, I went down to the very spot where all of this was happening in Israel, right there at the Jordan River. And it's like in the middle of nowhere. It's really not convenient, especially if you're from Jerusalem. If you're traveling from Jerusalem, it's a long trip. You would have to get up before daybreak, before daylight, and travel hard all day long. You would probably get there long after dark and then get up the next day and maybe try to find John and where he's at. So this is not a convenient trip, but thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people are making their way down there to hear John preach. And all of this is a problem. Specifically, it's a problem for the temple leaders. And the reason why it's a problem for the temple leaders is because every so often in the Jewish world, there would be a preacher or a teacher who would start preaching and teaching, and maybe they were charismatic, or maybe they had a new profound approach on everything, and people would be drawn to them, and before long, they had a massive following, and then eventually, somehow, for some reason, these people, these teachers would claim to be the Messiah. And then they would lead a revolt against Rome, and revolts against Rome never went well. They always ended bloody and in bloodshed. And so what would happen is when these people would rise up and they would have the potential to be another kind of wannabe Messiah, Roman officials would go to the high priests and the religious leaders, and they would say, hey, look, so here's the deal. You need to calm this situation down. Because if you don't calm the situation down, Rome's going to deal with it. And if Rome deals with it, well, nobody wants that. And so the priests and the religious leaders would go out and try to, calm people down. And it seems like John has the potential to be another one of these sort of wannabe messiahs. And it's troubling for the temple leaders, but that isn't even the most troubling part. What we read next is actually a whole lot more troubling for them. In the next verse we read, confessing their sins. So here's the picture. John's down there, he's preaching, he's teaching, he's doing his thing. He has this powerful message that people are just drawn to. And people are down there confessing their sins to John. It's important, though, that you understand that in the first century world, they had a very sophisticated system about how a person confessed their sins. If you lived in the vicinity of Jerusalem in that area, what you would do is you would go to the temple and you would find a temple priest, a high priest or an assistant priest or somebody who had religious authority, and you would talk to them about how you wanted to confess and what you wanted to confess for, and then you would have to offer a sacrifice. And there were different sacrifices for different things, and you'd tell it to that priest or that assistant priest, and they tell you what you needed to do and what hoops you needed to jump through, and then you would essentially do it. If you didn't live in the area of Jerusalem, you'd go to the synagogue and you'd do something very similar. But here, people aren't going to the temple. They're not giving sacrifices. They're just down there confessing their sins, not to a priest and not at a temple, but to John. And this was extraordinarily troubling for the temple leaders. But what we read next is even more troubling. And they were baptized by him in the Jordan River. The very thing that gave John his nickname was the most unsettling thing for the temple leaders. You didn't just do this willy-nilly in the ancient world. I mean, you had to have permission. You had to go talk to somebody with authority. And even more than that, baptism was for Gentiles, not Jewish people. But John is baptizing Jewish people. This is different. This is not the way that it worked. But John is down there and he's preaching this powerful message that's causing all this stuff, this unsettling stuff, this new to happen. Now, there was another guy by the name of John. He was one of Jesus' disciples, and he later on in his life, after Jesus went through all this and rose from the dead, and way beyond that, he would look back on all this stuff. He would look back on the incident with John the Baptist and what John the Baptist did, and he would write about this message that John was preaching that was literally turning the world upside down. And in John, what we call oftentimes the book of John, which is actually, it's a biography of Jesus' life, John, the writer John, the disciple John, would talk about John the Baptist's message. And here's what he would say. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light. So let me kind of talk about this. He's talking about John the Baptist here. He came as a witness to testify. That word witness and testify in your Greek, in the Greek are the same word. So you can kind of read it. He came as a witness to witness, or he came as a testifier to testify. But John came as a witness concerning that light. Now I kind of stop there. When he uses John, the writer, disciple John, uses the word light, he's talking about Jesus. He's writing from the perspective of old, looking back on everything, thinking about who Jesus was and what he did and what his message was. And he comes up with several metaphors that he uses throughout his writings to describe, that he feels like best describes Jesus. And light was one of them. So he came as a witness, John the Baptist did, concerning as a witness concerning Jesus, so that through him all might believe. Next verse. John testified concerning him. He cried out saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said," and here's where the message begins. "He who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." Now, I'm pretty sure there were people in the audience that day that are doing what those of you who are actually tracking with me are doing. I'm sure they were thinking, what in the world does that mean? Like, what in the world? And I imagine everybody's thinking, at least the ones who are following with John. And then eventually, now the Bible doesn't say this happened, this is the kind of way I picture it in my mind. Eventually, there's that one guy who finds the courage to do what everybody else was wanting to do, and he raises his hand, and he goes, okay, so John, can you explain that? Because I didn't understand that. That's super, super confusing. And everybody else in the audience is going, oh, I'm not the only one, thank goodness. So John goes, okay, all right, let me kind of explain it. I was here first, but he came before me. But when he gets here, just watch out. He's going to surpass me. And what John is subtly doing here is he's telling them, get ready, get ready, get ready. Something new is on the way. Something big, something life-changing, something that will literally change everything. Now, the writer John continues to describe this message that John the Baptist was using and preaching that would turn everything up on its end. And he continues and he says, for the law, and this is what John the Baptist was teaching, okay? This is the stuff that turned the world upside down. This is what was disrupting everything. For the law was given through Moses. Now, let me kind of stop here and say this. For those of us who've been to Israel, or those of us who've studied the Bible for a long time, or maybe even for those who haven't, here's what we know. For the Jewish people, the law was everything. I mean, it was everything. It was everything for them now, and for many Jewish people today, the law is everything. It governed every facet of life. It was so important. In fact, in the temple, there's this very special place called, or there was at the time, called the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies was a part of the law or the Torah. And in the Holy of Holies, there was only one person who could go in there, and they only went in there once a year. It was the high priest, the guy that they believed was the most holy guy in the entire nation, or entire world, really. He would go in there, and he could only go in there once. And when he went in there, according to tradition, what they would do is they would tie a rope around his ankle so that if by some chance he was in there and he died, they could drag him out. True story, Scout's honor. I mean, this was so important to them. The law was unbelievably important. People lived for the law. People breathed for the law. People even died for the law. And Moses was the lawgiver. He was the instrument through which God delivered the law to the nation of Israel. And he was considered to be every bit as important and every bit as sacred. I mean, you could talk about the law of Moses, but you didn't change it. You could illustrate the law of Moses, but you couldn't change it. You could talk about it, but man, you didn't mess with it. So the message that John is preaching that turned everything on its end is, for the law was given through Moses, and then he continues, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now this is the tension, and this is the reality that created so much issue in Jesus' ministry. This right here, what John is talking about, is why Jesus had so many problems with the religious leaders in his day, because they didn't like this. It's important that you understand that what John is doing here is he's contrasting two things. This is a contrast. He's saying, it was this, but now it's this. Moses brought the law, but Jesus, He brought grace and truth. And this is extraordinarily upsetting for the temple leaders. Now, eventually they decide, we got to do something about this. We got to at least figure it out. So they gather together, the upper level temple leaders, the high priests and all that. They gather together everybody, and they find some of the underling preachers and the priests and all that stuff. And they go, okay, look, we got to send a group of people down there and to find out who is this guy, what are his intentions, and what is his message. So John continues, and here's how he says it. Now, this was John's testimony when the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. So he sends a group of people down there, and I want you to picture this whole scene in your mind. John's down there at the basin of the Jordan River, and he's baptizing and preaching and teaching, and people are confessing, and there's thousands upon thousands of people who have gathered there. And all of a sudden, these religious leaders, they show up on the scene. Now, it's important that you know that these are well-known people in their community. So when they show up on the scene, they look different. They've got their nice fancy robes with their little tassels and all that stuff. And as soon as they show up, everybody's aware of their presence. So they walk down to where John is, and I kind of imagine, because they're important, the crowd sort of, parts for them. And about the time they get to John, here's what we read. He did not fail to confess, but confessed freely, I'm not the Messiah. So I'm going to take a little bit of liberty with the text here. I don't know if this is what happens, but here's the way I picture it in my head. They get down there almost to where John the Baptist is, and that guy at the front, who's kind of the spokesperson, the designated spokesperson for the group, decides he's going to come out with a question, but John cuts him off and says it outright. He already knows what they're going to ask, and he just tells them, look, I'm not the Messiah. I'm not the headliner. I'm just the warm-up act. So in the next verse, they look at him and they said, well, then who the heck are you? Are you Elijah? Now, the reason why they ask him if he's Elijah is because 400 years prior to this moment, prior to this encounter, there was a prophet in Israel named Malachi. And Malachi prophesied that before God would come and do his next big thing, that Elijah would come. Most people debated about what that meant. Some people thought it meant a reincarnated Elijah, or some other people thought that maybe someone would come with the spirit of Elijah. So the guys ask him, look, are you the guy that Malachi was talking about? And John goes, no, I'm not. So then they ask him, well, are you the prophet? Now, the reason why they ask him if he's the prophet is because Moses and the Qumran community had said, and they taught, that look, before God comes and does his next big thing, he's going to send a prophet. And so they're asking him, look, are you the guy that Moses and the Qumran community was talking about? So John says no. Now, in the next verse we read, finally, they said, well, who are you then? Look, let's cut to the chase. Let's quit this song and dance routine. Why don't you just tell me who you are? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? Look, John, we can't go back and tell them who you aren't. We got to have more information than that. That's going to get us, demoted, and we're going to have bathroom duty for weeks. We got to have something more substantial. And John, look, here's the deal. Who do you really think that you are? All this stuff is supposed to be done through the high priest, and it's supposed to happen at the temple. And who do you are that you just allow people to come up and confess sins, and you preach this instead of sort of message? And look, John, I don't think you're supposed to be doing this. So John answers this way. He replied in the words of Isaiah the prophet, and it almost seems like John doesn't really, care what they think. I am the voice of one calling in the wilderness, make straight the way for the Lord. So he looks at him and he goes, look, I'm just a guy. I'm just a warm-up act. I'm here to prepare people for the headliner. I'm here to help people, open people's hearts and open people's minds for the next big thing that God's about to do. I'm just the warm-up act. I'm a nobody, but I'm just doing my job. I'm doing my job. So in the next verse we read, now the Pharisees who had been sent questioned him. Well then why do you baptize if you're not the Messiah, nor the Elijah, or the prophet? In other words, John, look, you don't have the authority to be doing what you're doing. This is not the way that it's supposed to be done. You can't just go baptizing people here. You're not a priest. This isn't the temple. You're walking around like this living, breathing temple. You just can't do that. Verse 26, and it's as if John doesn't even answer their question. They ask him a question. He's like, I'm not answering that. I'm just going to tell you something else. I baptize with water, but among you stands one you do not know. He is the one who comes after me, and the straps of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. In other words, what he does is he looks at these guys and he goes, again, guys, I'm just a warm-up act. And I'm just here to get people ready for what the headliner is about to do. If you think all of this is unsettling, you haven't seen anything yet. If you think these crowds and what's going on here is impressive, you haven't seen anything yet, because there's a guy who's coming after me, and the news that he brings is going to be very unsettling to people like you. And the things that he will do will far surpass what I am doing. And guys, he's so much above me, I'm not even worthy to untie his shoes. Get ready. Something bigger is coming. So these guys, they turn around and they go back to their bosses, and they say, well, we don't really got much for you. I mean, we know who's not. And then he quoted from Isaiah, one of our prophets. And so the head honchos decide, okay, it's time for us to pay John a visit. Now, it's a total mistake that they do this, but they decide to do it anyway. So they load up, and these guys, they never traveled discreetly. They always traveled with an entourage. And so they load up the camels and the animals and the food and the people and all this stuff, and they make the trip in dramatic style all the way down to where John is. And John's just doing his thing, preaching, teaching, baptizing, letting people confess their sins, and people just keep showing up, and then they show up. And here's what we read. But when he, talking about John the Baptist, saw many of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Let me pause here and say this. Pharisees and Sadducees are two groups of people that did not like each other. They couldn't stand each other. In fact, the only thing they ever came together on was this singular idea that they did not like the new that Jesus came to introduce. That was all they ever agreed on. But the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to where he was baptizing. So get the picture. And this is dramatic. The other guys showing up was a big deal, but these guys showing up, this is a big, big, big deal. So they get down there and they've got this big caravan, and they snake their way down. And as soon as people see them, they have everybody's attention, because these are the most holy guys in the entire nation. In fact, if you were to ask them, look, what do you do? They'd be like, well, other than work in the temple, I'm just good. That's what I do for a living. I'm good. I'm just good. I'm so good that if God was going to do something, I would know about it. He would tell me. I would be the first one to know. These are the guys that when people took their kids to the temple, like if you shook one of these guys' hands, you didn't wash it for weeks. I mean, this is a big, hairy deal. So they walk down into this thing, and they get back right about to where John is, and John addresses them, and this is unbelievable. He says, "You brood of vipers." Like, now, when John says this, a hush falls over the crowd, because these are good guys. These are the holiest men in the nation. You didn't just talk to guys like this. But John is so bold, and he doesn't care. And he says, "You brood of vipers." And then he continues. He says, "Who warned you to flee from the coming wrath?" Because everybody there who's gathered with John has heard his message, and they understand something new is coming, and they're preparing for it. And it almost looks like that maybe these priests and the Pharisees and Sadducees have showed up to prepare too. But John knows better. And then what he says next, maybe the biggest dig of them all. He looks at them and he says, "Produce fruit in keeping with repentance." In other words, he looks at these guys and he goes, "You know what? You think you're good and everybody else thinks you're good, but I know better. I see right through it." Now, when John says this, what he's kind of doing with these guys and with everybody there, and I think ultimately with us, is he's giving them a heads up. What he's wanting them to know is that something new is coming. And the way that they used to do it is going to be put down. And the days of compassionless loophole religion where you have to jump through hoops, those days are gone. They're coming to an end. What he wanted these guys to understand is, look, Jesus has come to usher in something new where it's no longer right or no longer acceptable to claim that you worship God, to claim that you love God, and not have compassion for the people that he loves. What John wanted him to understand is look, that stuff's coming to an end. No longer is it going to be, you're not going to be able to say, look, I worship God on Sunday, and then on Monday through Saturday, I treat people like trash. Even if you feel like you have a good reason for it. Something new is coming. And the old was going to be over. You can imagine this was probably a short conversation. So these religious leaders, they turn around and they go back where they came from. And this whole encounter here is where it started the tension between Jesus and the religious leaders. Now we continue reading in the story, and here's what we read. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. So the things that John was talking about where he's just a warm-up act and the headliner's coming, this is what we're reading about now. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan where John was baptized the next day. So after that encounter with the jerks from the temple. The next day, John saw Jesus coming toward him. And I want you to kind of picture this for a moment. Jesus shows up on the scene. No entourage, no announcement, no fanfare, just like another one of everybody else there. And he walks up to where John is, and John's doing his thing, and he looks up, and he sees Jesus. And he knows who Jesus is. And Jesus looks at John, and Jesus knows who John is. And then John the Baptist decides to announce the headliner. And here's what he says. Look, in other words, he tells his audience, look, don't miss this. Don't let your mind wander. Don't get distracted. What's happening right now is the most important thing, and if you miss it, you'll regret it. So he says, look, and all the audience, focuses down. Then he says, the Lamb of God. Now, everybody who was sitting there listening, they knew what the Lamb of God was. They knew what a lamb was for. Perhaps their mind sort of flashed back to a moment when they were at home or maybe in the temple and somebody taught them about Abraham and Isaac and how Abraham was going to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice to God, but God stopped it and instead he provided a lamb. And they're going, oh, and in their world, everybody knew what a lamb was for. A lamb was how you atoned for sin. It's what you sacrificed when you went to the temple. Look, it's the lamb that God provided. And he continues, who takes away, literally meaning who lifts up and carries off the sin. And everybody knew a lamb was for sin. Everybody did. Now, you and I, we've heard this statement so many times, it really doesn't affect us the way it affected the people that John was talking to. For them, this was paradigm-altering information. Everything that was happening here at the Jordan River and everything that John was preaching and teaching and everything that he was saying was so new. They're going, wait, hold on, John. Okay, so first of all, like we're down here, like getting baptized, and we don't normally do that. You kind of have to have permission for it anyway, but they wouldn't give us permission because we're Jewish people. And then on top of that, we're confessing sins, and we don't do that here. We do that at the pre, and then atonement works different, John. And now you're saying, look, there's the lamb that got, and then their minds are spinning, and it's blowing their paradigms. But what John says next is absolutely mind-blowing for everybody in there. He says, takes away the sin of the world. And people are going, wait, hold on, John. You mean for everybody? You mean not just people that look like us and act like us and do the things that we do? You mean for everybody? Like as in non-Jewish sin? You mean like our enemies, Rome? John, I don't know if you know this, but like our whole religious system is centered around being separate from everybody else, John. Like we don't go to their house, they don't come to ours, our kids don't marry theirs, like we don't talk to them. In fact, John, I don't know if you noticed, but our entire history, Israel's entire history is centered around a struggle against other nations. We're looking for the type of Messiah that's going to drive these type of people out. And now you're telling me God's doing something new for the world? For people who are different than us? And John's like, yeah. Jesus came to introduce something brand new for the world. Ultimately, there are three brand new things that Jesus would introduce. He'd introduce a brand new covenant. I don't know if you know this or not. In your Bible, you have an Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament is technically a covenant, and so is the New Testament. They're relationship agreements between God and people. The Old Testament was a relationship agreement between God and the nation of Israel. It contained all kinds of different laws in it. Some of them were religious laws and ceremonial laws and civil laws, and there were some moral laws. But when Jesus came, he came to fulfill that old commitment, that old covenant, and to start a new one. And that may not make a whole lot of sense to you. The old covenant was a national covenant. The new covenant was an international covenant. And when you really understand this, what it ends up doing, and we're going to talk more about this, by the way, as the series goes on, but look, what it does is it clears up a lot of your confusion about the Bible. When you understand that new covenant that Jesus came to introduce. But that wasn't all that he came to introduce. He came to introduce a new command. By the time Jesus rolls up on the scene, there are 600 some laws in the old covenant. 600, over 600, and nobody could keep them. There were 600 commands that God gave Moses on Mount Sinai, and everybody did their best to try to keep it, and nobody could, and there was this big raging debate in their day and age about which ones were the most important and all that stuff, and then Jesus comes along, and he issues kind of this new command. He has this conversation where he takes all of those 600 plus commands, and he boils it down to two things. And then in one of his final acts, it seems like he paraphrases it by saying one thing. And it became, the new command was extraordinarily clear, but far more demanding than the law of Moses. But he came for a new command. And this, when you understand the new command, here's what happens for many of us. Christianity becomes much less confusing. Our relationship with God becomes much less confusing when we understand the new command that Jesus came to bring. But he came to bring one more thing. He came to bring a new movement. You, me, us, the church. And when you understand the new movement that Jesus came to bring, guess what happens? Church is never boring again. Some of you guys come on Sunday morning and you endure it and you're bored. And the reason why is because you don't understand the new movement, the new that Jesus came to bring. Now, we're going to talk about all of this throughout the series. But John was trying to help his audience understand there's something new that's coming. So Jesus walks down into the water. And he tells John, look, man, you got to baptize me. And John was like, dude, I don't know. This is the TJ version. Dude, I just told these people that I can't even untie your sandals. And Jesus is like, no, you got to do it, man. Because I'm here to bring something new that you started with your warm-up act. And I have to identify with you, and you have to identify with me. So John baptized Jesus. And that's where it all began. Jesus would go on to become the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. Your sin and my sin too. But before he did that, there would be sermons to preach, stories to tell, miracles to perform, and tables to topple. So we're going to pick it up right there next week.